Good morning, beautiful people of the internet, and welcome once more to the Sunday special live. As always, we are joined by Adam Lawrence, Piotr, Rusinek, and we're saving Helen for last. Helen Chorley. We are, as always, positioned in all corners of the planet, bringing you the news and the reviews for everything that is right, wrong, and could be better with the market. We normally start with Adam's summary, cliff notes, privy of his weekly roundup, but I get the feeling we'd be here for 6 hours before we got into paragraph 12. It was an absolute beast. And I still get the feeling
5,500 words and no apologies. Yeah.
I still get the feeling you were holding back. There were some bits there where I thought, oh, he could have, but he didn't.
The dam did nearly break a number of times. It would have made Norway look like a little pebble in a pond.
I think I was like about 45,000 words, and it took us 5 months to write it.
To be fair, this week's did take quite a while. I was chuntering away at the keyboard for a few hours yesterday, but
started last Sunday, did you?
It was a bit like, I'm not going to use the crude analogy, which is the first thing that came into my head, but I spent the whole week waiting for that and for this video, because I think Monday and Tuesday I probably did a combined total of about 12 hours in the car, various journeys. Wow. And I pulled in a few good podcasts, but you have to mix it up a bit, don't you? So there was a few hours of talk radio that slipped into there as well, just in the downtime or after a phone call or something like that. And people, the general public's perception, and not just the general public, the radio presenters and the professors that they get on these things, most of them need shooting in the face, quite frankly, because they just don't bloody know what they're talking about. And these awful tropes come out. The Bank of interest rate is a blunt instrument. Yeah, it's the only thing the Bank of England can do. Utter nonsense. Right? Go and look back at the minutes, and you kind of have to look at the news, and the financial news is nowhere near as guilty as the tabloid press. Never has it been, and hopefully it never will be. But now we've got the mortgage crisis. Oh yeah. I mean, imagine how you feel about that if you're a renter whose landlord kept your rent the same for 5 or 6 years, which is, I openly state, has never been the right thing to do. It's not the right way to run a business. And since good old George and his cronies forced us all into running businesses, whether we wanted to or not, back in 2015, it's not the way to do it. But now these people are facing these horrible situations. So they've got to put the rent up 800 quid to get to market. And even if they do that, they'll break even. And after the tax on the theoretical profit they're not even making, because they'll hold them in their own names, of course, they're losing money.
Yeah.
And they're desperately sorry for their tenants, but everybody's in a worse position. And, the Bank of England could do a number of things, right? Number one, they could sack the governor, because if they did, the gilt yields would go straight down. I'll tell you that for free, because he is currently, whoever the reverse of Big Sam Allardyce is when you're about to get relegated, that is Andrew Bailey, right? He's probably about to get us relegated another pip in the international credit ratings. I wouldn't be surprised to see that start to happen. The market has no confidence in the man. It is as simple as that. Would
you, Adam? Sorry to you were in full flow there. Would you? Who would you? Okay, 2 questions. It's a one question, but it's a 2-part question. Okay, the question is, who would you replace the current governor with? And are you thinking a previous governor that was impressive, that's obviously still alive, or do you think there's someone that's in the current committee or someone outside the committee that you think would have a positive impact on the recovery of the financial recovery of the nation?
So that's a great question, and because my attention span is so short, I always start with the second one and then forget the first part of the question, but I'm going to try my best. So look, I'll try my best with your first part. I don't think you can bring MC back, to be honest with you, on the optical level. I also don't think he needs to do it again for his personal CV and the challenge. Ultimately, he's Canadian. It's not, you could argue Rishi does what he does for patriotic duty. I'm certainly relatively in favour of that argument, although obviously the true tinfoil hat wearers all reckon he's in there for the deep state or whatever the bloody hell they want to call it these days. But I genuinely think the man is still one of the very few public service politicians that's still out there. Carney's got nothing left to prove. And also, let's be fair, right? Carney was magnificent at doing what it was Bernanke that said, central banking is about 98% talk and 2% action, right? And that's the problem. And it's the other way around at the moment. This is 2% talk. You need to be, this is COVID, as far as I'm concerned, for the interest rate and for the gilts market. Where's your briefing every day? Where's your leadership qualities? Where's your, and frankly, Jay, anybody on the current committee could do a better job than Bailey. He has proven himself to be utterly, utterly clueless. So I don't care if it's Bren Broadbent. I don't care. I'd be tempted to, there's a pretty popular movement in the States to appoint Joe Rogan as the governor of the Federal Reserve, which is not as amusing and jocular as it actually sounds, because he is someone he's proven himself to care about the truth. Now, listen, sometimes he goes down a conspiracy theory walking path, but he'd have a lot of people around him. And what the thing is, he wouldn't accept any of the bullshit. He would call out the stuff that says, what, we're going to lend some money to ourselves for like 30? No, we're not doing that. That just sounds like a scam, because it is, right? So we'd shove aside a lot of the BS that goes with some of the central banking, and it would be quite interesting. So in a way, I suppose our question is, who is our Joe Rogan, right? I think I'd quite like to see Rod do it, because he is genuinely impartial, and he doesn't care about what other people think about him, right? Frankly, any of us could do a better job than Bailey is doing at the moment. There's absolutely zero chance I would get it, because I wouldn't play any political games whatsoever to try and curry favour with anybody. I'd just upset them.
If it's 90% talk, then I'm out.
and I'm probably in, and Jay's probably hot on my heels. Yeah, absolutely. But
I mean, this is the reality of what you're saying, right? Because there is a massive sentimental element to any marketplace, right? And when you have naysayers, ne'er-do-wells, and nincompoops spouting absolute bullshit and misinformation to the nation, it snowballs. So if you did have that communication, if you did have that leadership, that would address some of the flex or bulging or restriction in the marketplace, right? Then you can start looking at policy, and then it's easier. Then it's less of a blunt tool, right? It becomes a bit of a sculpted art.
I think the pandemic is still super, super relevant, and I'm a bit annoyed about how much people keep phoning up the radio and saying Brexit's to blame for all of this. It's like, look, I voted Remain. Brexit's not to blame for this, because it's going on around the world, right? It's got what Brexit is to blame for is a lower GDP than we would otherwise have. Absolutely, 100%. Anybody who voted in that referendum who's got half a brain should know that, because most of the Leave side I spoke to who were sensible people, whose opinions that I respect, were willing to take an economic haircut. The reality is, when you follow a pandemic, you take another economic haircut, and it's no offense, Jay, like you going in to shave your hair right now, it's not going to make a lot of difference, right? So the reality is you can't whilst the beard looks magnificent, by the way, just to feather you with a compliment as I deride you with the one hand. So you can't, this is still COVID, and this should be addressed like it's still a crisis, but the communication needs to be spotless, flawless, unbelievably good. If Bailey doesn't want to do it, because frankly, when he gets and talks to people, it becomes fairly obvious that he doesn't know what he's talking about, and that's why he doesn't like talking, which I don't know why, because his career is currently ruined, in my view. He's not going anywhere from here. This is his, the Peter principle, you get promoted to your point of incompetence or whatever. He is 2 or 3 positions above that. He really is an outlier in this. But then send your best spokesperson. Send other members, send Broadbent, send Hugh Pill. Hugh Pill talks decently. He talks like a proper economist. He knows what he's doing. Bring Andy Haldane. Andy Haldane was the Bank of England chief economist for, I think, 28 years before Hugh Pill stepped in, right? Get Andy Haldane back in as the governor. He was the one who was making sense in 2021, talking about inflation, talking about nobody did anything about it. And back to our old pal, Mark Carney. The reality is, what this all proves to us is we could have had a better go at putting the rates up in 2015, 2016. And Mr. Carney should have stuck to his guns. And when unemployment went under 6%, he should have started moving rates up. Now, look, that's after timing. And I was on the side of people who were saying this economy is too weak to handle interest rates going up. And before this massive inflation, it was. Now, all that's happening at the moment is prices go up and wages go up, and everyone can afford less stuff, which doesn't help anybody apart from the government. And of course, go back to COVID and where conspiracy theories really started. And there, of course, you can divide this relatively easily, I think, now, knowing what we know now, into conspiracy theories that turned out to have quite a lot of basis in evidence, and conspiracy theories that were utter Swiss cheese, flat earth style stuff, right? That's always the way it is. But where does that come from? Well, it's because they're denied the oxygen of truth and questioning and publicity, and all they get is a party line from one very specific. I've said all along we should have had. Where was the chief statistician? Well, it turns out he's an 82-year-old drunkard who's bloody useless. So that's where he was, in the boozer. So, but then again, he still would have been better than Boris Johnson, and all we had was the doctors, was the chief scientists, and we didn't have enough mathematicians. We didn't, when we had people like Spiegelhalter, who we could have called on, heavyweight people who could have really been at the front end of this, and we could have had economists. And of course, I'm bloody biased because I'm an economist, but where was the question between the trade-offs we were taking during COVID? And this is a very similar situation to me. What could the bank really be? There's a number of things the bank and the regulators could be doing right now. What have we seen instead? The government's had to take control and sort of say, there, you don't know what you're doing, so Jeremy will tell you what to do. And of course, what Jeremy's going to tell you to do is something politically expedient, which is, we'll give you, what can we do without ruining the market in a still relatively conservative way? We can put the repossession moratorium back in place, because that was popular during COVID. It polled well.
Yeah.
Clever for politicking, doesn't really do anything to address the root cause of the problem. Right? What would I be doing if I was there? And I'm probably going to write at some length on this next week, I'd imagine. Right? 2-year fixed products. I see things at the moment that are grinding my gears. Right? The 100% mortgage product from Skipton. Yeah, fantastic. Where was it in 2021, guys? Where was it when people could actually afford to do that? When tenants could have bought at very low rates on property? Now, it wouldn't have been helpful because it would have blown up the market even more, right? So let's be clear about that. But still, introducing it 2 years too late is like a kick in the you-know-wheres for everybody involved, right? So it's pretty chuffing useless. I saw a sponsored ad this morning from Halifax saying, "Come and fix your mortgage for 10 years." And I commented on it saying, where were these sponsored ads 2 years ago when it would have been a good idea to fix for 10 years? Currently, it's not the greatest idea in the world, although I do get into the shape of the yield curve quite heavily in today's piece. But I would be trying to put an end to 2-year fixed rate products, quite frankly. Now, at the moment, the market is going to do that on its own. But I didn't realise how commonplace it was for someone who's just getting into a property for the first time. They're kind of coached into a 2-year fix, right? And it doesn't help anybody, or it doesn't help the customer. It doesn't help the customer, right? It only helps the brokers and the banks, realistically, because it means more fees and more total costs. And people look at and still on Facebook and LinkedIn, left, right, and centre, people are looking at the pay rate. They're not looking at the true cost of debt, right? And that's such a poor way to run a business. I'm spitting feathers on the amount of people that are doing it. But a 2-year fix should come with a wealth warning, right? Because look at the...
For people watching, watch last week's chat, because we talk about that, looking at all the costs, the all-in costs. So watch that.
Yeah, but not the APR, because a lot of people look at the APR, and the APR is rubbish because it talks about the reversionary rate and it factors that into most of the loan. And you almost certainly won't revert if you know what you're doing. So you have to actively ask, or I've started using this back of the fag packet way on the basis that I'm not comfortable mathematically that it's not perfectly correct, but I'd still rather that it was something everyone could understand. So if you've got a product that's 5% pay rate and a 2% fee over 5 years, divide the 2% by 5, you get 0.4, add it onto the pay rate, you get 5.4. That's the best metric you should be using, unless you can be bothered to get the spreadsheet out and do the inverse exponentials to work out what the exact rate is, right? You should also consider the legal costs and the valuation costs, right? And any ERCs are also worth bearing in mind and factoring into your models. Now, the way the yield curve has moved, the average pricing now on a 2-year product, including the arrangement fee, should be knocking in, if you're getting it from the swaps market, it's coming in about 7.75%, right? And that works for nearly nobody. You've got to be deep up in the old collieries to be getting any decent leverage on that sort of cost product, right? And you really got to know what you're doing if you're up there doing that. Otherwise, you'll buy pups, as we've spoken of many times before, right? So the behaviour is going to force the 2-year stuff away. It's going to take the 2-year option away from people, and it's going to push the 5. But because the yield curve has done this, where it's scooted up at the front end, and now it's started to suppress on the longer term, which is the right thing for the market to do. Because I've said many times before, I think the 30 years at like 4.5%, 5.1 when Truss was in charge, exceptional value if you're a pension fund. Now, I don't suppose we've got too many pension fund trustees listening, and even if they are, they've missed the bloody boat now anyway, because the long-term trend is to trend down towards zero. We have got a lot of the same problems as Japan, which has already proven what happens when you go into effectively zero growth for 30 years, right? Now, the difference is I wouldn't say welcome immigrants with open arms, certainly if your surname is Braverman, but we do have a business model as a country that relies on a hefty amount of immigration, and that produces growth through population growth, because the Japanese fertility rate is exceptionally low, even lower than ours. And although our indigenous one is going downwards, the amount of net immigration that comes in is positive for growth, because there's more people to sell stuff to. It's as simple as that. And also, obviously, unpopular with those who prefer the usual tropes, but in my experience, they come in, they work bloody hard. And they tend to rent property. So for me, they get a big fat tick in every box that there is, quite frankly. And there you go. And they still show some of the less motivated indigenous population what hard work and saving and a few good healthy values can do, actually. But then that's another conversation that no doubt will upset a lot of people. But that's the tip of the iceberg of today, really. There's so much in there. But what I've done is, and I don't think I'm renowned particularly as a lefty, although I've had plenty of people call me left wing and right wing, which normally means you're upsetting the appropriate amount of people, and I much prefer to live in the centre. And I did say, look, the banks are going to need to pay some windfall tax here. Now, I think Jeremy and Rishi already know that, and I think this is one of their weapons for the next election, right? Because it'll be very popular. Now, you have to get into the weeds a little bit here, because this was kind of slipped under the... If you remember what sort of chaos, really, we were in after... I renamed it the Qua crash, by the way, today, which I was really, really...
Yeah.
I was very pleased with myself. I was far more pleased with myself than I should be for such a poor quality dad joke. But the Qua crash, Jeremy came out and we didn't like him, did we? Because we remember the doctors and it wasn't ideal. But my God, we were glad to see we would have been, the Roy Hattersley tub of lard from Have I Got News for You would have been a welcome addition compared to the leadership team we had at the time. Right? Because literally doing nothing would have been better. Doing an inanimate object would have been better. Hence the lettuce being such a good analogy, right? Big and full of bloody air and water. Anyway, so Hunt slipped a couple of things in that budget, because of course we all saw it as well. He saved the world and he calmed the markets and everything was good. And now the lid's off the whole thing and everybody's realised we're not in control of core inflation at the moment and it's problematic, right? But one of the things he did was there was a bank surcharge, which is this is a very typical media trick. It's exactly the same for the energy companies. Energy companies pay a higher rate of corporation tax because of the nature of what they do. So instead, they just make these broad announcements of, they've made 9 billion off the backs of the poor and the old and all the rest of it. It's like, yes, and they're paying about 6 billion of that back in gigantic levies, taxes, all the rest, which is going into paying those people's benefits and pensions, which your company that you work for or own is not bloody doing. So cheer up maybe a little bit. So the banks paid this 8%, and don't get me wrong, I don't think it was enough, but they paid an 8% surcharge since the financial crisis to say sorry in a kind of way, and also keep the system relatively competitive with the rest of Europe and the world, which of course they need to for London to remain a global financial centre, although it has been hurt in the past 6 or 7 years for a number of reasons, primarily Brexit being one, of course, although Brexit does have two sides to the argument, because some people come because of Brexit, but net effect is still negative, right? So this 8% surcharge slipped down to 3% in November 22 that not a lot of us picked up upon, because we were picking up on the fact that Jeremy had saved the day, which actually meant that for banks, tax only went up 1%, whereas for nearly every other company, it went up about 6%, which doesn't really seem fair. And the pressure's been on in the meet, not heavily. You wouldn't have seen it outside. This is one of the things that disappoints me about Martin Lewis, right? And look, Martin Lewis has got a job to do. Primarily, it's to promote Martin Lewis, let's face it, right? But he does have to represent the retail investor. But with the soapbox he has, the man should really educate himself a bit better, quite frankly, because he has some serious influence. And he could have been putting pressure on banks since January, for example, to put their interest rates up for their savers, right? Because that's his client base, right? Savers is his client base. So why hasn't he been doing that? Now we're getting to the stage where they just stay quiet. Go back and look at Q123's Barclays and Lloyd's profits. Guess what? They made an absolute sack. And guess what? As this rate keeps coming up, they're going to make a bloody fortune, because the bad debts that they are going to foreclose on primarily are bloody C-bills and things like that the government's underwriting. I mean, this is blue sky stuff for the bank shareholders, right? So they need to pay, right? They need to pay, because they haven't paid back what they did to the whole world in 2008, and that money needs to be used for something decent. Now, my view, e.g. infrastructure investment, which we should have been doing more heavily, as I've been banging on about for bloody years, when the interest rate was zero, right? It's still not too late, especially with the current shape of the yield curve, for us to go back out to the market and start looking at some 100-year bonds and come out and say, again, if I was anywhere near the top, and we all know I'd only ever be a special advisor, I'd never be the face at the front, because the face just doesn't fit and the language is just not popular, right? But you know, maybe I could slide into an Alistair Campbell style role, although I just don't think I've quite got the steel to be quite as horrible to everybody as he was on a day-to-day basis. But I'm certainly pretty good at telling people what to do, right? So I definitely think I could tell them what to do, and that's one of the things I'd be very much telling them to do. They may already be on it and be saving it for something nearer the election, is the reality of that. But I cannot see, given what happened to the energy companies, I cannot see a windfall tax situation not being levied, which will help somewhat. But
I mean, they would have to do it so well, right? If they're saving a trump card for 15 months time, whatever it is, they would have to do it so well, because the majority of people aren't thickos. So if they see it coming up 3 months before they do an election, like, you've been holding on to this for 18 months, you've been letting food banks and children starve and blah 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 for 18 months, there's no chance it'll work.
Mate, they've been doing it for 13 years. That's what they do.
There's been so much in such a short period of time, because there was a bit of time where there wasn't actually on the main stage anything really going on. You take Brexit and COVID out. What happened in 2010 till 2006? Nothing. What happened between then and the leap? Nothing. All that happened was Brexit and COVID. So they've had two things in their lives to deal with, right? So everyone just kind of thought, well, they're guardianshipping it. They've not completely fucked the whole thing up, because nothing's happening. Right? Yeah, things weren't great, but they weren't terrible either. We haven't stepped into another war. No. Nothing like that's kicked off. So you take those 13 years and you take a good 6 or 7 out, and you go, okay, well, they ballsed up, a third of what they've been left with, right? And you think, okay, that's bad, but yeah, then again, we remember, what Labour did for the last 6 years they were hanging about for, right? And it's the same thing with left and right. You end up centralizing because they all balls it up to the same degree or another. Yeah. But what I think would be more impressive is if they started stage releasing things that were leading up. Then you build goodwill. If you started doing that now, then in 12 months' time, because in 12 months' time, you won't see another Conservative government for 25 years because it won't work, because none of them are good enough to pull a play off like that in a way where no one's going to stare up and go, well, that smells like horse shit. Wait, all of this, we're surrounded in shit. That people are going to hear that and feel that and see that.
Do you know one thing I still hold on to, though, Jay? There is one thing that's still really important here, right? You remember the old Alistair Darling note, or it wasn't Alistair Darling, but someone in the Treasury left a note saying, there's no money left or whatever, kiss, whatever it was, right?
Yeah.
Now, if we wind back a bit, when 97 and Blair got in, right, Labour were new Labour and people were excited. There was a genuine the marketing was sharp, the messaging was spectacular.
Education.
Yeah, I've got 3 things to say.
I'm still there. Yeah.
You can still remember it 26 years later, right? It was quite vivid, and we weren't necessarily, I certainly wasn't massively politically engaged in any way at the time. Although I didn't tell him that when my interview to PPE came up, Helen, obviously, but there we go. I did drop politics after year one as well, I must say. So just like I assume Liz Truss dropped economics before her prelims, because good God, surely she had no qualifications in it. Certainly not from the finest alma mater in the world. But anyway, you know, you remember it. You remember it with clarity, right? And what if you think about the funding problem they had? Because they had a similar problem in '97. Labour had to get over the fact that the Conservatives sold them as people who were going to spend too much money, right?
Yeah.
Now, it's going to be difficult this time because you just point to the Conservatives and go, hang on, look at the money that you've spent, right? So, you know, government has ballooned under Boris because he's a big government guy, because it means meals out and people paying for your wallpaper and whatever else, you know, you want to get into, right? So, but what Labour fired a bullet that I'm not sure is a bullet they can fire again. They fired the bullet at PFI, right? They brought private money in to build hospitals, build schools, build leisure centres, do all sorts of stuff, right? Local and central government. And they managed to deliver on a budget, and they righted the ship, and the economy was roaring by sort of 99, 2000, right? Now, the problem is, the reality of PFI is, those assets are paying those investors back over the next 60 years, and it's all hidden. And it was clever because it was off balance sheet. But again, that's not a good way. This is a bit like saying, well, I haven't told the bank that I've borrowed the other 25% on top of the 75%, and I promised the investor 30% a year because my striped shirt mentor idiot tells me that that's a good thing to do. And yeah, there's a bit of negative cash flow, but if it goes bump, I haven't signed any personal guarantees, so because that's what I've prioritised. So there we go. You know, you still owe the money, right? We still owe the money on PFI. So the bullet's fired on PFI. It would have been viable again back in 2021 because, again, you could have borrowed the money. I remember housing associations were raising bonds at 0.5% coupon. And I was thinking, this is utter genius. Please let them raise more money because we need to build these houses desperately. This is fantastic, right? Now, you can't do that now. But because the shape of the yield curve is where it is, so it's still inverted, but the 2 years got scooted right up, and the 10 years quite a bit lower than the 5 at the moment, right? There's still room for that 100-year bond that we were talking about a couple of years ago, because that might go out at a 2.5% coupon if we extend the yield curve, or maybe even a 2% coupon if we put a green spin on it. And then what we say to investors and pension funds and all the rest of it is, you can tick your ESG boxes, which, by the way, is something we're going to legislate for in the next few years. And you can do it now with this bond, or you might have to buy something worse. So do you want to buy this, or do you not want to buy this? And still get that money at maybe 2.5% and invest it in projects that work, you know? And that's again, this is what infuriates me, because there's such a lack of, I hate problems with no solutions, right? But what I hate even more is when there are potential solutions and no one even talks about them. Where is the forum to discuss these things? Why is it not being discussed on question time? No, because we have a question about, oh, wasn't it a shame the bloke in the nuclear sub or whatever? I mean, no, it just was what it was, wasn't it? It's a sad story, absolutely, right? And it sounds like there was a very typical entrepreneur involved at the helm of something, right, that drove behaviour in the incorrect way and made terrible statements like safety is waste at a certain point and all the rest of it. And then there's all the after-timers are coming out. You know, Ross Kemp's out saying, well, I didn't go. I mean, he told me to go and I wasn't going on. There's about 20 people I've seen popping up saying, unheard of people saying, well, I didn't go. I was invited to go on there and I didn't go and I didn't go. And it's like, okay, well done. Very clever. There's no way I would have entertained going on there for a second. It doesn't make me clever. It just makes me nervous.
Boris Johnson.
Sorry, Piotr.
Did you see a Twitter video from Boris Johnson promoting his article in the Daily Mail, saying we need risk takers like the people who died on this thing?
I didn't see it. Thank goodness I didn't see it.
These people make economies whatever going like, and I'm thinking, like, who is he talking to? He's only talking to people who already like him, and no one else is going to take it seriously. Well,
you can tell, can't you, that he signed this big money contract with the Mail, but the brief is, Boris, you can write about whatever you want. So you're going to see some utter hogwash from the man over the length and the life of that contract. But at the end of the day, he's at, 6 bars in speaking engagements since November last year or whatever, which to Rishi is not why Rishi's in the job, because frankly, that's a pay cut, right? But Rishi ain't turning up for 250 bags, right? He doesn't need to. But for Johnson, it is a step change in, you know, the aristocratic oaths lifestyle, and he's going to cash in on it even more than Blair, who interestingly is right back in the shaker in this consultancy that he's got. I don't know if the listeners are aware of that, but I think it's called the Tony Blair Institute in true messianic narcissistic fashion. But if Labour get in, which, as you've correctly stated, is the odds-on favourite position at this time, although we do need to remember things like if we extrapolated the local council vote, although the Tories took an absolute hammering, that only extrapolates into a narrow Labour majority. And there's going to be a really interesting period before the election, because I think they've got problems with making the numbers stack up, and I don't know what the silver bullet is. And there'll be something clever. There'll be a lot of gobbling off about non-doms and blah, blah, blah. And of course, those people are mobile with their assets, and they'll never collect the tax they say they're going to collect. But if it pacifies the gilt markets, we're okay. But you will be able to tell the night before the election and the week running up to the election if the gilt yields start to rise and rise and rise, because as soon as they get really engaged with the electioneering process, right, then that's telling you the gilt markets have got no confidence in Labour. And Starmer is not Blair. Starmer doesn't make you beat the chest and think. Starmer makes you think, blimey, mate, you're more boring than John Major. And I thought, I didn't think you could be more boring. I actually quite like John Major, because it's good that he's boring. It's good that he's boring. He was a good, boring man who didn't mind telling people shit they needed to hear sometimes.
But the only thing that Keir Starmer is really good with 2020 hindsight. Like, if he's saying, oh, this is what happened, that's went wrong, this is what we would have done. A, it isn't what you would have done. B, you would have completely floundered and foffed the entire time it was happening. And B, we would have been in a far worse position. You can't convince me otherwise. Sorry, Keir, it's just not going to happen. And it's terrifying to think that they can put someone like that in charge. You know, as a good opposition, he's not bad, because he knows how to, bring some... what's the word? He tries to hold people responsible moralistically, rather than this is what's better overall. It's kind of like, oh, John Smith from Cambridge during the thing couldn't see his wife, being buried and you went and had a party. Like, he's good at that kind of stuff.
He personalises it, even though his expense account was as disgraceful as the next Conservative MP's when he was the DPP before he was caught with his fingers in the till. But that's a sad state of affairs. But it's the dearth of talent problem, isn't it, really? This is why I still think, although I'm really disappointed with Rishi at the moment, because he hasn't shown any real... He needs to show some political gumption at this point, right? Instead of trying to appease. I don't know.
We've been banging that drum for a little while. I mean, probably not publicly as lot, but for years I've been saying there's just... Who do you replace who with? What's the lesser of the two evils? Well, now it's not even evils. It's like, what's the lesser of the least incompetent? Well, the problem is when you get below a certain point of median standards, just median, not even like just if you can get a median, you can't. It's not there. And the ones that are there are so off in different tangents or so aggressive in different ways. Here we go. So Keir Starmer is the middle management person.
Say no more.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So we invite Keir to the party. Oh, well, he's nice, I suppose. I mean, yeah, I guess so. Yeah, he's not going to upset anyone. Yeah, he'll bring a bottle of gin. Yeah, get him to come along.
He'll have no clue what the party's about, but afterwards he'll tell you everything that happened because he's got that 2020 hindsight. He knows exactly what happened. Hasn't got a fucking clue what is going to happen. Not even an educated guess.
We've got
and he's go on, Piotr. Go
on. The slightly different subject. I don't know how far we want to take this Keir.
We can segue. There's not that much more to say about him, is there? Really? I mean,
there's a question from Graham, and there's another one from Luke. Slightly different, but Graham. So, what are your thoughts on where interest rates will settle? Secondly, what would your safe haven investments be at this volatile time?
So I think I'd probably like to preface the answer to this part, or my part of the answer to these two questions, with a third point, right, which is a point I've made today in the supplement. We watch the wrong metrics, generally speaking, right? It's very possible for base to go up to 5.5, 5.75, maybe even beyond that here, right? I don't think it will still, because I think over the next couple of months, we're going to work out the core inflation issues that we've got. And I'm hopeful that July's number released in August will be better, right? But we might have to wait till August number. But I think it will be better. Although if we have a rip-roaring summer of great weather, people will spend more money. So we do need to bear that in mind, right? But it's the swaps market that we need to keep our eyes upon, right? So what will please the swaps market? Well, perversely, this is the blood in the water side of the economic argument, right? As and when unemployment starts to go up because we've got more liquidations and also people pull back on recruitment, they're still pulling back on recruitment. It's happening every month. It's been happening every month for 6 months. So there are a number of trends that are going in the right direction to help to calm some of this down. Services is a problem at the moment, but if we go into an insolvency environment, services will have to stop putting their prices up as well. And that will make a big difference that we need. So 5.5, 5.75 for me is still where I'm at, but I don't think that's the question that we should be answering. I think the swap rate is near the top of its range at the moment. We could have another test of the highs when we see next month's core inflation for reasons I've gone into in the supplement today, because I think core is going to go up again, maybe 7.3, 7.4 next month, unfortunately. And that's because that's the base effects argument to it, and the fact that I think we're having a good month for businesses in terms of money being spent. You'll have seen the Beyonce goes to Stockholm 0.3% on inflation argument. I'm sure another wonderful media circus of an economic story, but phenomenal to think that one event can make that much difference to the GDP of a nation, although Sweden is highly dependent on Stockholm for its GDP. It has similarities to London and the UK in terms of its pull. In fact, it's, I think, even more important to Sweden than London is to the UK, which is a big deal. Right, so that's the
investment.
So alternative, I think, we've been saying for a while, haven't we, the old 1970s saying where it's who can lose the least money in real terms, yeah? And, there's it's strangely, today, you can go and borrow from Tesco at 5.2% on a personal loan, and you can invest it in Chase for 5% returns. Now, someone's losing some money somewhere in that, because it's not costing them 0.1 in op costs to get that money out the door, right? So you can see there's very little margin in terms of moving monies around. It depends what your risk appetite is and what your time horizon is. It always has to. So some of these, some people who are listening to this, I'm assuming primarily property related audience, one of their best investments at the moment might be to pay down some of their more volatile debt, especially if they're on tracker rates, if they're sitting on money, because they might wait. I still think a crash is very unlikely. A trend sideways and a little bit downwards is the most likely path of this market over the next 6 to 12 months, right? But we're talking the kind of dribble that we're experiencing at the moment, where we get somewhere, we're having an argument whether, Nationwide says it's 4.7% down, Halifax says it's 1.2% down. The point is it's not going upwards, and the point is the price of everything else is going upwards. So your house is worth less in real terms, right? Although you've absolutely crushed it since the 1st of Jan 2020, so cheer up.
Right now, it's a really good time to be assessing the debt that everyone's got and the different positions. Because if you just move money around within what you've got, you might be making more money than actually buying new things or looking outside of your existing kind of environment.
100% agree.
And then some of our clients who come to us to sell properties in the auction, they're like, I want to sell this tool to pay down some money on 9% mortgages that I currently have, and then that's going to make me more cash flow positive and basically happy.
This is a point I've made in the supplement today. It's a terrible time to remortgage right now. It's going to take 2 or 3 more weeks maybe for the market to reform properly in order to get some slightly more competitive rates. But the lenders are nervous because the gilt yields are wobbly, and we've had a couple this week who are wriggling as much as they possibly can to try and get out of rates they've agreed to 2 or 3 months ago, which is disgusting practice and will stop us from using them again in the future, or at least we'll try and do anything we can to avoid using them in the future. But there you go. They're not, a lot of these smaller lenders are not so worried about reputational risk, which makes me laugh when they don't want to lend on a social housing or a charity project because they're worried about reputational risk. It's like we're not worried about shafting people, so I don't really believe that, to be honest with you, but there you go.
Hopefully the ESG will encourage them to get that,
but this is interesting because this is the big difference between 08 that people have talked about before, right? There's so much cash out there, so you almost need a financial repression, and this will be much more of a Labour policy than a Conservative policy, although as Jay was saying, I can't imagine they've got the economic nous to understand it, but you never know, right? It's almost a financial repression style. You will invest in green products like my 100-year bond, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't, we will legislate to say that you will do, right? So there's already a bit of this in the government consultation around the EPC certificate, saying that lenders will need an average of C for their mortgage books by 2030, otherwise they'll be penalised. Insurance companies will need an average of C in their insurance portfolio, otherwise they'll be penalised, because it attacks it from the other side of the fence.
Yeah.
And actually it looks like quite positive government intervention, and I say that purely because emissions from homes are a major league part of the problem, although frankly this means bugger all in the global scheme of the problem, because India, for example, is going to spend the next 20 years chasing what China have done, an outrageous growth of GDP with a much more exploding population, and is going to do irreparable damage to global warming. But how fair is it to say to India, well, you can't do that? Because we've all done it. We did it 1840 to 1900, largely speaking, and then we've absolutely cracked on from there. And then let's not talk too much about the empire, right? So we're one of the biggest sinners in the world. So are the Americans. The Chinese is off the bloody charts. But who's the world's police, especially as people like the US don't engage in the International Criminal Court? Who are they to be turning around and saying, well, we can't have this in India? It's like, no, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to put financial incentives in place to allow them to grow in a leaner, meaner, greener way. And that is going to take almost all of the money that's out there that at the moment, the reality is world GDP this year is up about 3%, 3.5%. And that's where we're on that path. And that path is trending downwards, right? We have done peak growth. AI might bring some productivity benefits. It might bring some GDP benefits, but the vast majority of those will go to a very, very, very small percentage of the population. And those of us who are slightly engaged with it will use it to make our day-to-day lives easier. It's not going to affect us SME business owners particularly massively. It might save us a couple of staff here or there, but some of us, like me, would actually rather give people jobs that they want and like, and recruit the right people with the right values, and give them the opportunity to go forward inside an organizational structure, right? So it's not all about what McDonald's might want to do and sack everybody because you can, leave a voice note for your order. That'll be the next thing, and that I will refuse to engage in that for reference. But that's just because of my hatred of voice notes. But this sort of thing is going to go on. So,
a couple of more questions. Charlie Lambden, never heard of the guy, but seems to be getting a lot of media attention recently. What Alan thought on his 25-30 house price crash prediction?
Just going to go and get some blood pressure medication from inside. Somewhere between hogwash and. Oh right, great. That's going to make me much calmer, Guy. Thank you for pacifying with the ointment there, Piotr. That's much appreciated. I think you've got to look at. You have to look at context when it. And we spoke about this years ago in the pandemic, because when the economy wasn't that fragile when we went into the pandemic, right? We had a very low interest rate, but we were doing okay. We had that Boris boom. Do you remember? Everybody was feeling good. The housing market was looking quite good. And then we had a big problem that for 6 weeks looked really very, very problematic. And then it was fairly obvious to those of us who kept our heads somewhere near our shoulders that things were going to get sorted. It was a case of what time was it going to take to get sorted. And then, of course, good old HM government pulled out the biggest teat you could ever imagine and allowed us all to suckle on it quite excessively, right? So, but as I was saying, during the pandemic, the big danger was a black swan on top of the black swan, right? And that's what we had with Ukraine and Russia, right? And that put pressure on the energy markets. And at that point, we were very, very vulnerable say Europe as a whole was very vulnerable, because something on top of that could have been really problematic. Instead, what actually happened is a 5-year problem, aka Germany are using 50% of their gas is from Russia and 40% of their oil, or whatever it was turned into about a 9-month solution, because the Germans put their minds to it and sorted it out. And now there's a worldwide LNG market where you can still buy LNG in the States at about $2.25 or something, and the European price is about $13. And the reality is the LNG businesses in the US are going to bring that market closer and closer together, which favors us a lot and really hurts Biden. But he's he doesn't understand all this stuff. So there we go. His strategic petroleum reserve is being used in the least strategic way I could ever possibly imagine. I mean, it needs renaming, the totally unstrategic petroleum reserve. But the context is everything, right? So this is 1980, average house price 20k. 1987, average house price UK 60k. 200% gain, 7 years. 1994, average UK house price 54k, right? So peak to trough, 10% down. Yeah. Inflation in the period 87 to 94, 58% over that whole time period, right? So in real terms, houses went down a lot, but there wasn't a real slump. If you speak to people who traded the London market in the 1990s, they would tell you, prices just didn't move. Between about 90 and 97 in London, prices just didn't move. And I used to say this to people back in sort of 2012, 13, when they were saying, oh, it doubles in Islington every year or something. It's like, well, it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't.
Really
Let's look at how much it went up 22% in 1 year. That was an awful lot. It's still 78% off doubling, but never mind. But also that rise is not sustainable, right? So there's going to be a bubble being created, and then when a bubble is created, there is a prick in that bubble, and it depends how big the bubble is allowed to inflate. Right now, despite my utter contempt for the woman, what the lettuce did do is she deflated that bubble slightly before its time with the old Quarcraft budget, right? So the market was overheating. We've gone up 25% in 2 years, 30% in Wales, 30% in Scotland in 2.5 years. That's way too fast in a world where interest rates were very low and GDP growth is very low and salary growth is very low, right? But that started deflating it then, and then we've had a bit of a wobbly bridge up until now, where we're back at the same sort of rates we were at when dear old Liz was in power, right? So we've had 9 months of the market doing nothing. In fact, the peak was August 22. We've had 10 months of the market doing nothing or going sideways. In those 10 months, wages are up about 7 or 8%, and that's the average. Well, this is the average, and we've had an energy price cap which got us over the worst of it, and energy prices are going back down again in July, and they're coming back down, and people are starting to fix contracts again and get their utilities prices under control, right? So you tell me where the 25 to 30% crash has to come from, and this is where normally people then wheel. There are about half a dozen utter horsemen of the apocalypse that ride around the UK media and have done for. I often cite this famous article in The Economist, a publication for which I have a significant amount of respect. It was either 2001 or 2003, I can never remember, but it said it was this argument why UK house prices are so terribly overvalued, particularly in London. London proceeded to go up 100%, go down a tiny amount in 2008, really, and then go up another 100% when all the money from abroad flowed in and blew things out of control. Now, of course, again, people like me in 15, 16, they were saying, right, this is over. London's going to have a tough time. It's going to be a flat market. I was talking in the context of those two massive rises that were unsustainable. So to me, my timing could have been wrong, and my timing isn't always right. There's no two ways about that. But the logic is so sound, it can't defeat itself. Whereas the logic today for a 25 to 30% house price correction, when net migration is 600k and maybe 800k this year, builds are going down, housing starts are going down. Big developers who, let's face it, build nearly all the houses these days because the SME development market is crushed by CIL and 106 and all the rest of it. They're all playing a political game where they just hold on to the land for a bit longer because they want the next help to buy. They want the next help to buy to sort things out here. And with the mortgage rates the way they are, we're going to see some kind of government scheme to try and make sure that market does keep moving. But you've got lower supply, you've got more problematic regulation. The supply demand argument's gone. It's gone, and it's not really getting any worse because it's just terrible. It's absolutely terrible. So the only thing left is the affordability argument, and this is the UK, Charlie. If you're listening to this, so welcome to the UK. People are obsessed with buying houses. Bank of Mum and Dad has got more money in it than you can ever imagine. 9th biggest lender in the UK, and generally does the top slicing. So it's actually the biggest and most aggressive, riskiest lender in the UK, right? Its coffers have swollen gigantically over the last 3 years, mostly because Bank of Mum and Dad is mostly propped up by house prices, because that's where they're getting their money from to trickle down to the children when they're doing it in these situations, right? And there's
we've got our chance.
Quick, speak.
I was gonna mention a little bit about the auction market.
Oh,
So
go
I feel
for
I
it.
was,
Oh,
I
you
was
back?
cut off in my prime there. Sorry.
your
What I was
prime.
saying was, why do we need this correction when mortgages have been stress tested at 5.5% just for 10 years, right? And now the pay rate is 6. So, and it's probably going to go back down a bit, and it can probably go down to about 5.5, which won't be particularly problematic. So where's the market conditions for 25 to 30%? It's just utter nonsense, right? Utter nonsense. But
It's
if we had
another
a
statement
sensible,
of sentiment, right? It's a sentiment statement rather
it's a
than
clickbait. It's a
Yeah.
clickbait headline. It's a clickbait
Yeah,
headline
yeah.
by someone whose ideology trumps actual real data and facts, and it's just utter hogwash. So we could probably go back to Guy's question, and then I can breathe and calm down maybe a little bit. Or Guy's statement. What did he say again? Because I've got on a soapbox.
I asked how to describe the difference between a correction and a crash, and then he also said he agrees with you on the house price versus inflation analysis. How prices have in real terms fallen in double digits in the last 12 months.
Absolutely right. But we do have to remember, Guy, as well, putting that into context, over the 2 years before, they were up double digits in real terms. So I think I did a very back of the fag packet analysis in last week's supplement, and I think we're about 5% above where we were in real terms at the start of the pandemic, which probably still needs to come back to roughly where it was. But in my context argument, in the 2010s, house prices around the country were down 7% in real terms, right? But nobody talks about this because nobody understands it enough. But the point being around the difference in a correction and a crash. A crash, 2008 is definitely a crash. Sudden withdrawal of liquidity was the driver, sudden being the key word, and the market nearly stopped in terms of lending, and cash was king, and there wasn't that much cash in the coffers out there. Of course, people and businesses still had cash. Correct. 87 to 94 is much more of a correction. Prices were too high. Myrus was withdrawn, although it was withdrawn over a number of years. The mortgage interest relief at source, as I'm sure you'll remember. Interest rates went particularly high. Lots more people are on variable rates. This is the propagation of nonsense on LBC. I've been really disappointed in a couple of the presenters this week because they're just saying the wrong things. Like, oh, it's much worse than it was in the 80s. No, far fewer people have got mortgages. The LTVs are much lower, right? There's so many more owner-occupiers who've got money in their house and they owe nothing on it at all, right? And only 5% of people are on variable rate mortgages who are homeowners. 5%. So 1 in 20 of the 2 in 7 are currently in trouble. Well, last time I did maths at school, that's what, 2 over 140. It's 1 in 70 households. Well, no wonder the government isn't worrying too much about it, apart from taking the easy political point scoring of a repossession moratorium, which no one is really too worried about. So a correction is going to be something that takes place over a number of years. A crash is going to be a sudden adjustment, and a correction really is a real terms significant adjustment, and that's where the time period kicks in. Whereas a crash is much more of a it looked okay in July 2008, or well, no, it didn't really, did it? But it looked okay in July 2007, and by January 2008, it looked really bad. But we didn't hit the bottom. we didn't hit the bottom till sort of May 09, really. Hello, Abby. Oh.
She's pointing at Piotr and saying, "Art." Closest we're getting to Piotr at the moment, isn't it, Bubba?
That's what we should call him from now on.
Is that what you're spending the language lessons on, Jay?
100%, yeah, 100%.
All right. Great. Well, we're talking
about auctions, Jay.
I was just saying I was reading yesterday the Essential Information newsletter, so the June newsletter, which basically came out for the May auction. So just kind of pretty much word for word what David Sandman said. At a national level, there has been a notable increase in the number of lots offered across the board. Compared to the same period last year, the volume of lots have increased by 22.1% in May of 2023. 19, and this is a 19.6% increase for the period between March and May 2023. So that shows you where the real jump has been. So you can correlate that to news that's come out. That's real kind of reactionary.
There's stock. There's stock where there was no stock. Yeah.
Exactly. And 16.1% from the period. So this is an increase year on year from June 2022 to 2023. He does temper that by saying, however, it is essential to note the percentage of lots sold has seen a slight decrease, with the most significant drop being 7.9% occurring over the period. And a lot of that will be mispriced stock, right? That'll be vendors who or auctioneers who haven't actually priced in the market changes. But we looked at the Savills auction, which was last week. That was a fairly strong auction. And I think of the unsold lots, I picked out 4 that were interesting. That I kind of thought wrong price, right opportunity. So part of our Monday morning call is to see how viable those are and whether it's good for us or who we can place it with. Overall, there is some real tangibility to people exiting the market, because that's what you do with some old tired stock that may be underperforming. It goes to the auction. Very rarely can they be bothered to get it vacant, tart it up, and stick it on the high street. So you're seeing a bit of that. That's my gut feel. You're seeing a bit of that.
Well, especially as cash is at a premium at the moment, right? So it probably makes more sense. And I think people often make mistakes in those situations, because if they looked at it with fresh eyes as a deal, then they would probably be a buyer of something like that rather than a seller. Depends on age, depends on location. But at the moment, you could also understand why people might want to preserve the cash they've got and go, do you know what? I am taking a bit of a bath there, but you know what? If it's 10, 20 grand, so be it. I'd rather have the money in the bank than go through the hassle and the developments, the redevelopment side of it.
Yeah. And in there, they do a market précis of each of the different regions. The only region across the board to have upward only green ticks is the Northeast. So Cleveland, County Durham, Northumberland, Tyne and Wear, those kind of areas.
Yeah, see,
everywhere else is feeling a pinch.
And I find that not surprising at all, because I've been saying for some time down at the PIP London meeting, you're the reality of some of your options, people who live in London at the moment. Whereas I've traditionally said to people, look, go out to Kent and you can go and get some yield that stacks up. You haven't got to go a million miles, right?
Yeah.
And working in Kent at the moment, guys. Yeah. So where do you have to go? Well, do you know what? Look at some of the Freeport areas up in the Northeast. And I think yield chasers, a majority of people won't go there because they're quite concerned. But the minority who do, you can't come to Birmingham anymore and get the yield. You can't come to the East Midlands anymore, really, and get the yield. You've got to go right to you're going up towards the Weed, Northeast Links and beyond. And you're pinning some hopes on Freeports in Hull and, regeneration in Teesside and some of the, and it's genuine projects that are going on that are well worth supporting. So I understand why. I think it's probably the best time there's been if you want to keep deploying funds and move the world forward. Because we could, going back to Guy's question about the correction, we could spend a few years in the weeds here. We could have quite a flat market for some time. It goes down a bit, it goes up a bit, whatever. That's what worries me about some of these 2-year products with a 5% fee on them. Because you are going to get 2 years down the line and you will not be able to remortgage at the right value in order to pay that fee back. And again, not enough people, for me, are saying that. And I would be getting absolutely stuck in with both feet, telling people what to do left, right, centre, if I was anywhere near the PRA or the Bank of England, which, of course, I will never be. So never mind.
And it's always good, and we try and do this where possible. Nothing that we have said in today's call constitutes legal or financial advice. Please contact an IFA, blah, 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 all the other standard stuff. I mean, there were some questions there about, where would you put your money? Like, I could come out with some absolutely brilliant ideas, but don't do them. Because God knows what your personal circumstances are, or what things you can't. There's only so much you can foresee. Like you have to invest in what you're comfortable with and what you're willing to risk. Essentially,
if you are prone to being attracted by very large returns, and I always see it when someone puts up a post that's an obvious scam on Facebook, and a lot of these people sometimes are drawn in by a very slick salesperson who's at the front end of that process, and the person selling you the scheme doesn't know or think it is a scam, right? They've been duped themselves. but they need to educate themselves a bit more. I'd highly recommend subscribing to a guy on YouTube called CoffeeZilla. I don't know if you've come across him, but he gets tucked into some of the major Ponzi schemes that are out there. Right, he's got about 3 million subs now, I think. He really does get into the detail, and he really does have a good go at some of the big. And there may or may not be reference to some people in the property trading industry from the United Kingdom. I cannot possibly comment on whether there are or not, but hopefully there'll be some more of them, because he's like Mike Winnett on steroids. If you know Mike Winnett, you know he really is he's the big dog of Ponzi pouncers at the moment. I reckon a few people will be trying to take him out. But yeah, if you're susceptible to that, look at CoffeeZilla. But read about efficient asset allocation. Yeah, and don't take big risks in volatile stuff unless the big returns are there. You must take risks you get paid for if you accept risks at all. You must take risks you get paid for.
Okay, guys, 10:05. Our listeners want to go and have a great Sunday.
I don't blame them. They've already had a great hour, Piotr, haven't they? They've had a great hour. So.
How do you top this? How do you top this? Wow.
Well, top this. We all go and watch CoffeeZilla and like binge on. And then I'm going to drop him a DM and suggest some property developers who might like to also have a look at.
That would make for some good viewing.
Amazing, really good chat. Thanks everyone for listening on all our different channels. And if your comments haven't popped out on our chat, that's because somehow we don't get them technically. But we
had problems last week, so sorry about that. And I don't know if we're having problems this week, but
we did get a message from StreamYard saying that we'd had problems with LinkedIn connections last week, apologising. So I know that did happen. That was a problem their end, but hopefully we're over that now. We seem to have been getting LinkedIn comments today, Piotr, don't we?
Yeah, some of them, yeah. But in case we missed someone, we'll come back to those in the text form. Brilliant, guys. Great Sunday.
Have a great
Always
Sunday,
lots of fun, everyone. Thanks a lot.